Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. Before I get started, allow me a moment to give thanks to the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a sponsor of the show. The Society is the primary professional association for historians of this period, and they publish an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. If you like this show, you'll love the journal, and you might want to consider joining the Society. You can find out more on shgape.org. That's shgape.org. Now for today's episode. There are a few books that come along that define their field of study so comprehensively that every professor will put it on their reading list, and today I have just the one. This one is about anarchy, the idea and the movement, both of which collided with American industrial society in the Gilded Age in such a way that it is without comparison, I believe. Because when you think about communism had a natural base among the working class. It had an ideological origin in Marx and Engels, and it had a nationalist exemplar in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. But anarchism had none of that. And yet the anarchists played a substantial role in the development of the United States, from the Haymarket Affair in 1886 to the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti in 1927. The movement perpetrated several acts of political violence, and it's worth saying that anarchists faced a barrage of political violence too. The state, the police, the courts all repressed the anarchist movement in a startling number of ways, the effect of which transformed the criminal justice system and immigration laws in the country. So this is all to say that we have needed a book like this about anarchism, and Professor Michael Willrich of Brandeis University has delivered. Michael's previous work includes City of Court, Socializing Justice in Progressive Era Chicago, and Pox, a history of the smallpox epidemic that rattled Gilded Age America and created the healthcare system as we know it today. His latest book is called American Anarchy, the epic struggle between immigrant anarchists and the U.S. government at the dawn of the 20th century. It has already made a deep impression. The Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era have bestowed its Presidential Book Prize to Willrich, and he has also joined the top ranks as a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I am delighted to welcome Michael to the show. Thanks for joining me, Michael.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to talk about this book because it is one that needed to be written. Anarchism is such a big idea and movement in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and we don't have enough books about it. Your story begins with the deportation of Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, anarchist lovers and philosophers, and it's a great opening. I'm not going to dwell on that because I think actually the bigger story here is what in the world is anarchism? I mean, it's such a nebulous term, and the movement itself is incredibly nebulous. So I wanted to give you a chance to take a whack at the low-hanging fruit, or maybe not so low-hanging fruit.
Absolutely. So anarchism was a transnational movement. It emerged as a set of ideas and arguments, really, at the same time, roughly, as modern ideas of liberal democracy and Marxian socialism emerged. All these were sort of products of the Enlightenment and were sort of forged in the cauldron of 19th century developments, the growth of capitalism, the rise of nation states, the growing inequality, movements across the political spectrum in that era, the debates over enslavement. But anarchism really distinguished itself from Marxism in that it insisted upon arriving at a state of true liberty without a state, right? Without law, without any kind of structures of authority of any kind. So anarchists really took aim at some of the most taken for granted institutions of modern Western civilization, marriage, organized religion, law of any kind, the police and carceral institutions, and private property above all. So these are the sort of principles that anarchists subscribe to. And what brings them into such a kind of clash in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States are a couple of different factors. One is that so many of the anarchists in America during that period are immigrants. And therefore, we can talk about that more, about what their status as immigrants really means. And also, they're arriving at a time when the U.S. is going through a period of state building at kind of every level, the local, state, and federal levels, and developing new kinds of state structures with new kinds of rationales. And the anarchists just get into a lot of trouble in the way that they critique these institutions, and which they see as the handmaidens of capitalism itself.
What I really found interesting about the book in terms of that definition was that actually amongst the anarchists, there's a lot of debate and division over their ideas. So there's this overarching debate of like a sort of anti-statism. But then when you drill down into that a little bit, violence is not always promoted. In fact, when President McKinley is assassinated, there's a real debate amongst the anarchists if that was a positive thing. And there's, many of them say it wasn't. So is there a way to positively define anarchism as something that's not just against statism or institutions or oversights or regulations, but something that is, I don't know, some utopian positive definition?
Absolutely, yeah. So anarchists had in mind this end goal of absolute liberty, individual liberty, unrestrained by man-made law. This is sort of Emma Goldman's definition. And out of that positive vision, they developed this critique of the state as is essentially coercive, and the rule of law, which in American sort of liberal ideology is associated with freedom, is seen as the guarantor of freedom, even against this kind of force of opposition against overweening state power. This is where sort of civil liberties ideas take root in liberal ideology. The anarchists thought all of that was bunk, that in fact, concepts like the rule of law or due process or individual rights in American legal culture were really window dressing for the sort of brutal oppression of the working class by both industrialists on the one hand and by sort of the police, their allies on the other. But the positive vision was one of a world of sort of voluntary cooperation between producers and voluntary kind of contracts, almost a kind of guild-like world, rather than one in which there were institutions of private property that were sort of propping up power structures.
Brilliant explanation. You mentioned the other big part of the book, which is the federal Justice Department. The foundation of the FBI is discussed in the book, and it of course is, as you say, a natural enemy of this utopian vision because they work for the state, they protect that system. But besides that philosophical and existential threat that anarchists pose to the state and the federal Justice Department, isn't there something behind law enforcement's disdain for anarchists, including, well, you mentioned this a little bit in terms of immigration, but there's a revival of nativism in this period too, right?
Absolutely. So this is the period that I really focus on, sort of the 1880s to the 1920s. In the book is a period in which mass immigration is this is the heyday of mass immigration in America. And the sources of that immigration are changing in a way that really causes concern for native stock Americans. So you have a shift in the sources of immigration from Northern and Western Europe to Southern and Eastern Europe. And the vast majority of the anarchists who by the turn of the century are, publishing little magazines, are speaking in the public squares, are having, hosting all kinds of events, or spreading their ideology. The vast majority of those leaders are from two of the most important immigrant streams of the turn of the century period: Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire, the vast Russian Empire, and also Italian immigration, and particularly from southern Italy, but from Italy in general. And so there's two sort of distinct groups there. And if you look at the nativist, the surging nativism of the late 19th and early 20th century, a great deal of it is directed at these two immigrant groups in particular. And when the Johnson-Reed Act is passed in 1924, establishing new quotas, the whole goal of that act is to go back to 1890, right? To bring the try to bring the American population back to square one before these groups started to enter the country by the millions.
Yeah, and it is the millions. That's the big difference between that later surge of second wave immigrants. I mean, cards on the table, my grandparents both came from Southern Italy in the 1920s. So
there you go.
Part of that wave as well. And of course, that was the same time Sacco and Vanzetti were on trial. And that's all part of this story too. But going back to the very beginning, before we get into the likes of Sacco and Vanzetti and other Italian immigrants, your first chapter highlights the Haymarket Affair, which is this sort of, in Gilded Age and Progressive Era history, this sort of anomaly and paradigm shifting moment. And it puts labor activism as a parallel to anarchism in this time. So my question to you is, did the industrialization of America give rise to a unique moment in our history that really reshaped philosophy, criminal justice, and I don't know, everything in that moment of the Haymarket Affair?
I think so. So the Haymarket Affair occurs in the mid 80s, 1886, 1887, right at the very year that contemporaries called the Great Upheaval in American labor relations, right? It was a year of more than 1,000 strikes across the United States, most of them aiming at an eight-hour workday. And the anarchists were a very small kind of group within the American labor movement. They were at their sort of radical fringe. Some of them embraced the 8-hour day as a cause. They debated amongst themselves whether that cause needed to, have whether legislation might be beneficial at all to this. The folks pushing for an 8-hour day were, for the most part, looking for laws to establish this and collective bargaining rights and things like that. The anarchists believed that there should be an 8-hour workday, but they also were sort of pushing beyond that. But industrialization and the struggles over industrial capitalism, which had created great inequalities of not just wealth, but power between corporate employers and wage earners in American life, definitely was the sort of wellspring of great activism among the working classes of the United States. And the anarchists are one kind of small group within that. They're, by 1910, they number, one estimate is they number about 100,000 people in the United States, compared to a much larger labor movement, in which I think the American Federation of Labor by that period has more than 1 million members.
So what are the dynamics there? Because not all labor activists become anarchists, right? Just, they're a small number, they're a small portion of that. So what's the dynamics? I mean, is Mother Jones happy to have Emma Goldman around, or is she like, you're screwing up my vibe here. I'm trying to get, I'm trying to get laws, for an 8-hour workday, and you're trying to end the state. How does that work?
So Goldman's alliances were closer to, she did a better job of sort of forging durable alliances with liberals, with sort of more affluent Americans who believed that government repression, censorship of the arts, that sort of overweening sort of Puritanism, as they might have called it, in government regulation of print culture and the arts had gone too far. And control on any discussion of of birth control and the like. Goldman was very successful at gaining some well-positioned allies who could help fund her magazine and help support her, but also help make her case in the public square for greater free speech rights. She was more successful at forging alliances, I think, with a few influential folks in that realm than she was at really, creating a kind of broader class consciousness towards her particular vision of freedom. One of the sort of most revealing moments in this regard came very early in the career of her and her one-time lover and lifelong comrade, Alexander Berkman, when after the Henry Clay Frick shut out the workers, the strikers at Homestead, Pennsylvania in 1892, they came up with this basic plan to assassinate Frick, and seeing this as what anarchists would call an attentat, a spectacular moment, a spectacular action that would fuel class consciousness and spur a kind of revolutionary moment. Berkman goes to Pittsburgh, seeks out Frick, gets an audience with him disguised as a reporter, fires 2 bullets into Frick, fails to kill him, but ends up incarcerated with a sentence of 21 years. The Union men who had been leading this strike at Homestead for, I think it was months at this point, he encountered them in jail, and they wanted pretty much nothing to do with him. They thought that his action had only detracted from their efforts to gain legitimacy for their and power for their union. So there were sort of frequent episodes like that. On the other hand, Goldman and Berkman and the anarchists in their sort of New York-based group were quite successful at forging strong relationships with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, formed in 1905 in Chicago, and then which gained real power bases in the Pacific Northwest and also in places like New Jersey and New York. The IWW, in its cause of one big industrial union, was much more radical than the conventional labor movement of this period, advocating direct action, sabotage, strike efforts. And some of them were themselves devoted to anarchist principles. And you can see throughout in the Emma Goldman papers, in her publications, in her public events she staged, she's very often working with IWW leaders to promote her causes.
Emma Goldman is such a fascinating character. I think one of the things that your book does so eloquently is to build these characters into fully formed, or as fully formed as you can with the sources that you have. And I feel like I'm doing her a disservice in a sense too, because I should have given you the opportunity to tell us who is Emma Goldman, where did she come from? Because she's an immigrant, but she makes New York very much her home. And you tell this wonderful story about her early life before she becomes an activist. And I want to give you the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, Emma Goldman's just an amazing figure. We've had a lot of books about various aspects of her life as a as a gender radical, as a sex radical, as an anarchist speaker. She grew up in the vast Russian Empire. Her family had some wealth, but sort of fell from respectability. She is Lithuanian by birth, educated both in sort of St. Petersburg and in for a period of time in Prussia. So quite well educated and sort of classically educated. She immigrates to the United States with her sister at the age of 16 or 17 in the mid 1880s. And she's a working class person. She's a seamstress. She works in textile factories. And she eventually ends up in New York City, where she encounters Alexander Berkman, who is similarly a newly arrived immigrant, also very young, incredibly idealistic. And they both get drawn almost immediately into the anarchist movement. And the defining moment for them is the execution of the Haymarket defendants in 1887, which they view as many liberal Americans did as well, as a kind of act of judicial murder. The defendants had been subject to a really stacked trial process, and four of them had been executed. So she emerges as this kind of voice, very young in the New York labor movement, starts appearing at strike rallies. She gets groomed by this older radical named Johann Most, a German anarchist, and she immediately shows this talent for public speaking. She's kind of an enthralling speaker, and over time, she really cultivates that, and she can speak by the teens. She is speaking in audiences of kind of American born elites, where she can talk to them about literature and theater, as well as her radical ideas in clear English. And then she'll cross town and go down to the Lower East Side and speak in Yiddish to a massive room filled with Jewish garment workers. She also speaks in German. She's incredibly articulate and smart, and she's a literary figure. She writes books, she writes essays, she publishes this journal, Mother Earth, in New York, and she goes on to, as it becomes impossible for her to leave the country without being deported. It's a complicated story, but as the immigration officials make it impossible for her to leave and return to the U.S., she becomes a bona fide national figure, and she's traveling around the United States on these speaking tours every year after 1905, 1906, until she's finally deported in 1919. She's legendary. She's on the front pages of the newspapers all the time. The reporters call her the anarchist queen, and American parents used to tell their children not to misbehave, or Emma Goldman would get them. So she's kind of this bogeyman figure as well. I came to really admire her greatly.
Yeah, I have to say, after reading it, I'm just sort of astounded by one person's unending sense of self-righteousness. Not just self-righteousness, but also the righteousness of her cause as well, and the unwillingness really to cede anything. I mean, her ideas about sexuality, free love, fascinating stuff. You called her a literary figure, and you point out in the book that Gilded Age anarchists were kind of shadowy figures. They weren't really like Emma Goldman. And I was just wondering, does celebrity have something to do with this story as well? I mean, we see the emergence of nationwide celebrity in the Gilded Age generally, but is Emma Gold tapping into that as well?
Very much so. So to the extent she is able, like, she would love to have been she would love to have been even more successful, even more visible. But she this is one of the main themes of the book is the engagement of anarchists with the legal system. right? And one of the reasons she becomes such a staunch advocate of free speech is because that's words are the way she makes her living. Words, published and sold in the kind of in the marketplace of these little magazines and cities like New York, books, but especially her ability to speak in public, to fill lecture halls, uh, uh, and um, and receive a kind of stream of income from doing that. Um, she is both seeking to, maintain this persona as a true radical, but also at crucial points seeking to broaden her range of support by reaching out to affluent and middle class liberals through some of her really the cultural conversations that she engages them in. She and Berkman found an educational center in East Harlem in Manhattan called the Farrer Center, which is both a kind of anarchist school, and you can only imagine what an anarchist school might look like, but also in the evening, a cultural center where artists talk about their work, where novelists come in and talk their work. Man Ray was an artist teacher there. The leaders of the Ashcan School of Art, including George Bellows and Robert Henry, were teaching art there. Clarence Darrow would come speak there. Playwrights of the period would speak there. So she was very much sort of tapping into this broader interest in American in celebrity, but reaching out in very different ways to different constituencies. And this is part of what made her such a prime target for public figures, politicians, Justice Department officials seeking to make their careers by stamping out anarchism.
Absolutely. And you pointed out already that the Haymarket anarchists, or at least four of them, are executed in Illinois. And given that your book is really about civil liberties in the broader theme there, but going back to the point that your book is also character driven, which makes it so readable and accessible. Lawyers are a big part of the story. You mentioned Clarence Darrow there, but also at the heart of this is Harry Weinberger. He's really the figure that you use to tell the story about civil liberties. So I wonder if you could tell us about him.
Yeah, so this whole project kind of began with the Harry Weinberger papers, this vast collection of his legal papers, which are at Yale Manuscripts and Archives Library in New Haven. He came out of a similar milieu to the place where Goldman and Berkman established their careers in the Lower East Side of New York. But he just had a very different kind of experience. So he was younger than them. He was born in 1886, 1887. And his parents were immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were Jewish. His father was a fruit peddler on Houston Street on the Lower East Side, literally selling fruit from a cart. But Weinberger sort of came up in this world and embraced education, reading, and really developed this. He's a tiny person, 5'4". He put on his passport application that he was 5'4.5". He grew up in this pretty rough and tumble area where he was constantly getting into fights with the Irish gangs by the East River. But he aspired to be a leader. He aspired to be a politician. And in America in this time, the law is the language of politics. And so he got a night school night school law degree at NYU Law at a moment when the night school at NYU Law School was filled with immigrants like himself, strivers. Many Jewish lawyers came out of this law school. And so Weinberger gets out and he tries to become a politician. He's just much too um, kind of arrogant and difficult to really make a career that way. But as a lawyer, he's pretty good, and he takes every kind of law business that comes his way. He's a solo practitioner. He's just scrambling for work at a time when Jewish lawyers are vilified by the mainstream bar that seeks to sort of drive them out of the profession. But even as he's sort of making his work doing real estate transactions and things like that, he really finds a kind of passion for cases involving claims to personal liberty. And so some of his earliest cases are representing parents who refuse to get their children vaccinated. He meets Emma Goldman through her work as a birth control activist, advocating open access to knowledge about birth control, and he gets drawn in by her into the anarchist movement, and and not as an anarchist himself, but as a true believer in the Constitution and the common law and rights claims. And together they really helped. It's an argument of the book that they really helped to create some of the energy and movements and causes that lay the groundwork for the modern civil liberties movement that is still with us today.
It's a convincing argument, I want to say as well. I think it's the unintended consequences of the actions of anarchists and civil liberties activists is so interesting because, the back to President McKinley, the assassination of McKinley does not inspire or doesn't galvanize the public towards anarchism. And if anything, it repulses the public. And yet what does galvanize the public towards civil liberties is the federal government's reaction to Goldman and Berkman and other radical activists who are being denied their rights. Is that a pretty fair point?
Very much so. So in the teens, the birth control movement that anarchists is that Emma Goldman is such a key figure in, along with her, who's a one-time protege, Margaret Sanger. They are being arrested in public squares in New York City. Their publications are being seized by government officials. They're running into all kinds of trouble with the American state simply for promoting knowledge of birth control among the working class. And this draws a lot of sort of, liberal, more affluent liberals to have a kind of rapprochement with anarchism, to provide some funding to the legal defense funds for Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger. But what really accelerates this process you've just mentioned is World War I and then the ensuing Red Scare, which leads to this massive crackdown of radicalism of all sorts, in which the government really brandishes the label of immigrant anarchist or alien anarchist as a means to seek to round up and imprison and ultimately deport hundreds and even thousands of radical working class voices, people whose conflict with the state during World War I starts because of their opposition to the military draft, but then this sort of grows with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918 and concerns about the spread of Bolshevism to the United States.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up World War I because the dynamics for civil rights and for anarchists changed dramatically. You mentioned the draft. I might ask you to elaborate a little bit more on Lewis Kramer and what happens there. But then also for Goldman and Berkman, things change too. And it's not about dodging the draft for them as much as it is about propaganda and information and criminal conspiracy around sharing that information. So on those two fronts, how does the draft and propaganda, how does that play out and change the dynamics of civil liberties in America?
It's incredibly important. So the World War One, the U.S. mobilization for war came late in that conflict, and it was incredibly rapid. It was accompanied by surging nativism and by just demands for, we've got to mobilize men and money very quickly. We need everybody on board with this. There was a real demand for compliance and conformity, kind of understandably in the moment. The anarchists, Goldman and Berkman in particular, were quite important in places like New York City in forming an anti-draft movement, right? And opposition to compulsory military service, which, if you think about it, is the kind of an ultimate example of government coercive power over the individual. They were very careful to try to avoid getting arrested for their activism. They tried to sort of work around at the edges of the law, but they had these rallies that in New York City gathered thousands of working class people and became sites of these brutal clashes between anti-war activists and the police. Many young radicals got arrested and imprisoned, including Louis Kramer, the Russian-born Jewish radical who you mentioned, who works is arrested in Madison Square Garden for handing out pamphlets, just pieces of paper opposing the military draft, and gets locked up for 2 years in prison as a consequence. Out of these kinds of conflicts, a number of activists and lawyers on the sort of liberal left become more and more interested in problems of free speech, and they drive a series of cases up all the way to the Supreme Court that have very sort of consequential effects.
And you got to tell us about those, because the courts are decidedly anti-anarchist. I mean, not surprisingly, perhaps, but from state magistrates all the way up to the Supreme Court, their rulings on conscription, free speech, and sedition, they really uphold, well, a rather draconian view of civil rights that I don't think we'd be familiar with today.
Very much so. So the First Amendment is, prior to these episodes, is almost a dead letter in the United States. Someone like Harry Weinberger, who is making he makes almost absolutist arguments in favor of the First Amendment, that the right to free speech knows, or should know, almost no limits. His view is really kind of a utopian interpretation of the First Amendment. And during one kind of legal battle after another, as you say, judges ranging from the sort of New York criminal courts to the state courts up to the U.S. Supreme Court are upholding really stiff penalties for people who speak out, in particular against the war. The sort of preeminent case in this period is the Abrams case in 1919, when the Supreme Court upheld the convictions of a group of New York anarchists and one socialist who later becomes an anarchist, who are sort of the next generation Goldman and Berkmans in New York, upholds their convictions and their sentences of 15 to 20 years in prison for leaflets that they handed out opposing some actions of the Wilson administration in regard to the emerging Soviet, what becomes the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik state. The arguments that Weinberger and others make in these cases, though, does begin to sort of chip away at these older understandings. And we now remember the Abrams case not for its holding, but for its dissents. The dissent authored by Oliver Wendell Holmes and signed by his fellow Associate Justice Louis D. Brandeis, in which Holmes declares that these young anarchists really had every right, as much right to publish their little leaflets as the US government has to publish the Constitution, now vainly invoked by them, he says. This is also the opinion when Holmes talks about a marketplace of ideas. And it really becomes this sort of, that dissent becomes the sort of foundation for modern liberal ideas of the First Amendment that come to take hold over the next half century.
And in the months after the war, things get rather turbulent. I mean, and it's not necessarily a result of these court cases, although I imagine that some anarchists would be reading the court cases and, you know, they might be inspired by Oliver Wendell Holmes, but they might also be really despondent about the verdict overall, which was not in their favor. And I happened to read a review of Stephen Johnson's book called The Infernal Machine, which is a history of dynamite and policing and terrorism. And you point out that no group is perhaps more known for the use of dynamite than the anarchists. So I'm just wondering, well, A, why does that become their weapon of choice? And in the months and indeed years after World War I, how do bombings and dynamite really strike terror into, I mean, they kind of make the anarchists feared.
Yeah, so the association of anarchists with dynamite really goes back to the era of Haymarket in the 1880s. Johann Most, the German-American anarchist, really promotes the idea of a propaganda of the deed rather than sort of propaganda through words. And for that, he views and asserts that dynamite is the great leveler. So this new technology of the 19th century that is so important in construction projects and things like that, and sort of creating modern American infrastructure, mining, and so on, is also seen by anarchists as kind of a readily accessible, powerful tool to respond to the guns and, you know, Gatling guns and sheer numbers of the industrial, you know, the police backing the industrialists. So there are sort of early arguments for that as a key tool of anarchism. And it is at Haymarket, when a bomb is thrown, it's still not entirely determined who threw that bomb. But a bomb is thrown, which is essentially a little dynamite bomb, and that explodes amidst the crowd, and 7 policemen are killed. In the years to follow, anarchists have a real debate within the movement about the use of force, and under what circumstances it can be effectively used. But there are these signature moments where anarchists do use bombs to create great public spectacles, and with very deadly results, including, I think, the sort of most notable in the pre-war period is the Preparedness Day bombing in San Francisco in 1916 that kills 10 innocent people. Most of these most sort of biggest, spectacular, and deadly bombings are now kind of widely understood by historians to have been caused by Italian anarchist leaders. But Goldman and her group were closely associated with some efforts as well, including an unsuccessful bombing plan to bring a bomb to the Rockefeller estate in Tarrytown, New York in 1914. The bomb instead blows up in the apartment of the bomb makers, and kills 4 people, injures 19, and spews, you know, masonry and building parts across this area of East Harlem. There is, yes, the public and political image of the alien anarchist as a deadly terrorist is not without, a real foundation in the activities of some anarchists in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and that evolution from the post-war Italian anarchism, which you dwell on a small bit, in the years after the war. I mean, the mail bombs that go off, the reaction is the Palmer raids, right? The Attorney General, raids several properties across New York and elsewhere. I mean, can you explain to listeners what was happening in the aftermath of the war? I mean, it's the Red Scare. We kind of know that, but I think what your book spells out is that there is real violence, there is a real reaction, and together they reshape our understanding of criminal justice for the future years.
Yeah, so I guess the most important thread that I would sort of pull out of this very chaotic moment is this is sort of the moment when the federal government, and particularly the Justice Department, seeks to capitalize on an insight that had been developing for decades, which is that the federal government, which lacks under conventional, traditional constitutional understandings, it really lacks its own system of police power or a broad-based criminal law authority, could nonetheless attack domestic radicalism of all kinds if that radicalism could be associated with immigrants, because the federal government by this point has plenary authority, has full authority in dealing with immigration. And if they could attach radicalism of all sorts to the label anarchists, that they could, the Justice Department could use immigration laws essentially as a force for policing disorder in the United States itself. And this is what happens as in the post-war period, there are demands for a crackdown on the Communist Party, on socialists, on radicals of various stripes, using not just the label Bolshevik, but the label anarchist. And it was a very ironic association to police communists as anarchists. But the Congress had enacted a law in 1918 allowing for the deportation of anarchists solely for their political beliefs or their membership in an organization that espoused anarchist beliefs. And so several of these sort of Russian organizations had charters, which, in my view, arguably few of the members even read, that spoke in violent terms about capitalism and the state. And even though the reference point in those charters was really Russia, Tsarist Russia of an earlier period, this was very handy for Justice Department officials, including J. Edgar Hoover, who was at that point directing the radical division of the Justice Department, to round up folks in New York, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, cities across the country in late 1919 and early 1920, and carry them to Ellis Island and begin a process of deportation.
And that's, of course, what's going to happen to Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. We haven't actually talked about J. Edgar Hoover much at all. We haven't talked about Louis Post, who's a big character towards the end of your book. We haven't talked much about Sacco and Vanzetti. And the truth is we're not going to have time to talk about all these people, which for me, I hope is a encouragement for listeners to go out and pick up your book, because you're going to get a lot more from this book than just what we've talked about today. But I want to ask what happens to Emma Goldman and what happens to Alexander Berkman, because that's, central to the story, and also not only what happens to them, but what is their legacy?
So they get deported in 1919. It's really in Emma Goldman's case, it's a deportation that is like 15 years in the making, going way back. But by 1919, uh, thanks to this act of Congress, all of the burden of proof for deporting a non-citizen who has anarchist beliefs that are published, it's the burden of proof is so low. And in Berkman's case, the deportation case is really pretty much open and shut. In Goldman's case, there's a complicated question about whether or not she was a U.S. citizen by virtue of a marriage to a naturalized U.S. citizen, and in her teenage years. I'll save this for the readers of the book because it's a really fascinating tale involving very high up officials in the Justice Department and the Department of Commerce. But they do get deported, and they're deported on a ship carrying 245 other Russian Jewish, mostly Jewish radicals who've been swept up in this first round of the Palmer raids. They're deported to to Russia. Very complex process involving all kinds of diplomatic intrigue and military force. And once they arrive in Russia, they sort of see this as their moment to influence the Bolshevik Revolution underway towards anarchism. They could not have faced a more inhospitable situation for doing that. There's one moment I write about in the book where they actually have an audience with Vladimir Lenin, who calls them to the Kremlin. And I won't give that story away, but he really does not support their vision for liberty and freedom, and I think he really, based on what he says, sees them as sort of somewhat corrupted by bourgeois American ideas of liberty and free speech. The legacy, so they continue, they flee Russia, they continue to, both of them, to write and to be involved in radical activities until their deaths. Goldman, her legacy in particular has been really significant since I think it's really the rise of the New Left and New Left scholarship, in the late 20th century, and then the Emma Goldman's Papers project at Berkeley was enormously important in collecting documents, government documents, and her letters and letters of her comrades from all over the world, from libraries all over the world, into a single massive collection that is much of which is now available electronically in a digital database, which I drew upon heavily. I mean, approximately 70 microfilm reels worth of material. It's just truly an extraordinary archive. But her legacy is both in areas of free speech and in areas of sexual liberty and feminism, and your sort of radical critiques of inequality. And I think today her voice also rings out powerfully in our whole debates over immigration, and the demands that the U.S. be deporting more people, and the way in which a new kind of ethno-nationalism in American politics has been demonizing immigrants to the United States. She really stands, I think, as a powerful, her work is a sort of powerful counter argument to that kind of narrow vision of what America has been and ought to be.
I'm going to actually say it's even bigger than that, because I think, yes, I mean, obviously, this is an election year. Immigration is, and by election year, I mean global election year. This is more people voting this year than I think any other time in
Wow.
history. So we obviously, India, they're talking about immigration. The UK is going to the polls in July. They are talking about immigration still. The United States, but worldwide, this is a big issue. But also, what struck me about your book was that the idea of nonconformity individualism, and even libertarianism is something that is very popular in America, perhaps more so now than, or even isolationism, which, wasn't on the docket in American political history until Donald Trump in 2016. Now suddenly people are talking about isolationism again. So these ideas are seeing a revival. And I'm just wondering, if we had to go back to the 1880s and look at where we've come, how far have we come? I mean, a reductionist might say, we haven't come that far. But, and we don't really have a contemporary anarchist movement, do we?
There are certainly anarchist voices in American life today, including, I would say that there's a certain anarchist strain to the capitalists who advocate, getting rid of, not getting rid of, but creating sort of different currencies, right? Bitcoin and the like is kind of an anarchist idea, right? Why should states have a monopoly on the medium of exchange? There were certainly strong sort of anarchist resonances in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and in the rebellions against the World Trade Organization and sort of international economic trade agreements earlier in this century. And there are, just from the response I've gotten to the book and sort of emails and some reviews, there are definitely anarchist scholars and voices out there writing today who see themselves as part of this longer tradition going back well before Emma Goldman for a half century to Proudhon in France and Bakunin in Russia and so on, and Kropotkin in Russia as well. So there's still a strain for sure. And I think that American liberals have taken on board some of the basic arguments about freedom of speech, and as a powerful goal and powerful theme in American life that before World War I were really had little traction.
I think that is really inspiring, and not least because I think on this podcast we talk a lot about how industrialization transformed the last 100 or so years, and the speculation that technology is the likely thing to transform the next 100 years. And that idea about Bitcoin being to having the blockchain as, taking away an authority. I mean, that is really what it does. It removes the authority from banking transaction or financial transactions. That to me seems a remarkable parallel. Well, Michael, thank you so much for this. This is so the book is wonderful for a lot of reasons. I didn't even get to ask you about writing, but at some stage I need to have you back on because the book is beautifully written. It is character driven, which makes it rich and accessible, and it's a wonderful story that needed telling in a time where the anarchists had a real influence and clearly still might do, I guess. But thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.